brain that's undergoing profound developmental changes during adolescence is called the striatum, and that's the part of the brain that is important for what we call reward-related function. So motivation, your responsiveness, how important you think rewards are, and how much risk you're willing to take to gain those rewards. And we know, again, that insufficient sleep is linked to changes in reward-related decision-making. So people who are sleep deprived take greater risks because they perceive less in the way of consequences, negative consequences of their behavior. And impulse control, obviously a very, very important component of adolescent development, selectively being affected by sleep loss. Now, shifting a little bit to the physical health realm, there are now multiple studies in adults, adolescents, children, and even infants that strongly suggest that shorter sleep amounts are associated with an increased risk of obesity. And we know that we have an epidemic in this country, particularly concerning of obesity in children. Now, there's lots of potential reasons for this association, but certainly we know that sleep loss and the circadian misalignment, so sleeping or trying to be awake at a time when your body is telling you not to sleep or not to be awake, results in negative impacts on cardiovascular function, on metabolic control, including insulin and cortisol, particularly has effects on two hormones called ghrelin and leptin, which are very important in regulating appetite. And so sleep loss increases your appetite and decreases the sense that you're full. So people who are sleep deprived tend to eat more, to eat higher calorie foods, and to consume higher fat content foods. Your eating patterns can also be affected by sleep, so that many adolescents skip breakfast, for example, particularly because they have to get to school so early there's no time to eat in the morning. And they may consume relatively more of their calories in the evening hours, which again contributes to increased risk of obesity. And if you're exhausted all the time, again, those prefrontal cortex mechanisms, judgment, motivation, how are you going to make good decisions about healthy eating or sticking to a diet? And finally, if you're too tired to exercise, that is another contributing factor to the risk of obesity associated with sleep loss. There is also some literature, growing literature, that suggests that caffeine use and other stimulants as well may have long-term negative effects. So studies have suggested, for example, that the earlier kids consume caffeine and the more caffeine they use, especially if they're less than 12 years old, that may predict later use or an increased risk for use of illicit drugs and alcohol. There also may be an association between caffeine and cigarette smoking, in that caffeine tends to increase the reinforcing effects of nicotine, and in individuals who smoke, they metabolize caffeine more quickly, so they may have to use more to get the same effects. And so this raises the potential role of caffeine, particularly as we go beyond coffee and tea and chocolate and soda to the myriad of energy drinks that are out there, many of which have very high levels of caffeine, that these may actually function as a gateway drug, in the sense that these individuals are more likely to smoke, to use alcohol, and to use other kinds of drugs. So caffeine use, particularly in youth, may not be a benign thing. And finally, drowsy driving, which is a very, very important issue. So probably an underestimated one, because unfortunately, many of these crashes are fatalities, because the individual is asleep and thus makes no attempt to avoid the crash. And young drivers who are inexperienced, greater risk takers, so those under 25 are involved in the majority of the estimated 100,000 police-reported fatigue-related traffic crashes each year. And again, those numbers are probably a vast underestimate of how many crashes involve sleep loss as a component, perhaps in addition to alcohol or in addition to other drugs. And the National Sleep Foundation poll again found that more than 2/3 of high school seniors admitted to driving while drowsy, 15% at least once a week. And we know from some work that we've done looking at sleep loss in medical residents that impairments related to sleep loss are equal to or greater than moderate levels of alcohol intoxication. So as a parent, of course we would not willingly allow our adolescent to get behind the wheel having consumed 3 or 4 beers, but every time they drive themselves to school in the morning, they're probably more impaired because of chronic sleep loss. So how does start times fit into all of this? Well, probably about 20 plus years ago now, we started to see studies which showed an association between decreased sleep duration and lower academic achievement. So in general, the studies suggest that students with better grades sleep longer, contrary to what many students think they have to do. So the National Sleep Foundation poll again in 2006 found 28% of students reporting falling asleep in school at least once a week, more than 1 in 5 falling asleep doing homework, and again found this relationship between grade level, grade achievement, GPA, and sleep amounts. So the questions that get raised about this issue of school start times and sleep in adolescence include some of the following. So, does delaying start times result in students obtaining more sleep, or do they just stay up an hour later and it really doesn't have any positive impact? So, virtually every study that has examined this issue has found that students do not change their bedtimes, that they go to bed at the same time after the start time change, and they sleep in longer as much as the start times before and after get later. So in Minnesota, which was one of the first school districts, Edina, Minnesota, and Minneapolis, Minnesota, back in the mid-90s, changed their school start times and found that the average school bedtime stayed constant at about 10:40. Another study involving grades 6 through 12 in a school district that delayed high school start times by an hour from 7:30 to 8:30, bedtimes did not shift later. And in a study that our research group did in an independent school in Rhode Island that delayed their start time by 30 minutes from 8 to 8:30, school night bedtime actually moved earlier by about 40 minutes. And that was a little bit unexpected. we didn't think that was going to happen. And we're not totally sure of the reasons, but anecdotally, we had students afterwards say that they felt so much better getting that additional half an hour in the morning that they were motivated to go to bed earlier. And that they were much more efficient at getting their work done, so they could go to bed. So, as a result of this, do sleep amounts increase and do sleepiness levels decline? Again, in Minnesota, sleep duration, because there was an hour change in start times, increased by 1 hour per school night, and a total of 5 hours per week. In another school, which delayed their start times from 7:35 to 8:15, students slept an additional 35 minutes on average. In the independent school that I just mentioned, sleep duration, because of the shift to an earlier bedtime, actually increased substantially to almost 8 hours. Still falling short of optimal sleep amounts, but much closer to that sometimes elusive goal. And in a study that was just published a couple of weeks ago, this was a study of 8 public high schools, which represented some 9,000 plus students in 3 states, found that the percentage of students who were sleeping at least 8 hours per night was only 33% at a school start time of 7:30, but 2/3 of students were getting at least 8 hours of sleep when school started at 8:55. At the independent school that I mentioned earlier, again, with only a 30-minute start time change, students were less likely to report problems with daytime sleepiness compared to prior to the change. There was a decline of students reporting being sleepy in class, too sleepy to do their homework, falling asleep in class, arriving late. And all these changes were highly statistically significant in virtually every parameter of enhanced alertness that we looked at. And in another independent school in New England that we subsequently studied, a 25-minute change in that particular case also resulted in students getting more sleep and reporting significantly less daytime sleepiness. What about school attendance? So in Minnesota, they found that tardiness rates dropped, daily attendance rates improved, the percentage of high school students who were continuously enrolled in the same district, in the same school increased, and dropout rates declined. In Chicago public high schools, absences were found to be much more common for first period classes at an early school start time, as you might imagine, compared to afternoon classes. In Kentucky, a change from a 7:30 to an 8:40 start time resulted in significantly improved daily attendance. And in the independent school mentioned early, there was a 36% decline in students who were cutting or tardy for their first period class. And this is important because appropriation of federal dollars for schools is partially dependent on student attendance data. Thus, reducing tardiness and absenteeism could actually result in increased funding and further offset costs that might be related to delaying start times, related to transportation, etc. What about academic performance? Big issue, because of course we're concerned about the health of our students, the well-being of our students, but we also want them to maintain a high level of academic achievement. So in the early studies in Minnesota, for example, grades were found to improve slightly, but not at a statistically significant level, but they did find that SAT scores for the top percent, 10% of students, jumped significantly. In Chicago public schools, student grades and test performance were notably lower for first period classes compared to afternoon classes, not a surprise. And performance on end of the year subject-specific standardized tests in math and English correlated with whether or not the student was scheduled for that subject during first period. So whatever you're taking first period is the subject that you're least likely to do well. Again, in Kentucky, changing from a 7:30 to a 8:40 start time, found standardized test scores went up, and there was no change in students participating in either extracurricular activities or athletics, which is also, of course, an important consideration. And finally, in the study I mentioned earlier that was just published a couple of weeks ago, showed the most robust findings thus far in regards to academic achievement, in that 5 out of the 6 schools studied showed a significant increase in GPA pre-post in the core subjects of English, math, science, and social studies. But there are other parameters which are equally important, which are also positively impacted upon by start time delay. Mood, many studies now, has shown to be significantly improved with less self-reported depression in students after the start time was implemented. Our own studies found that there were a decreased number of health center visits and requests to go to the health center to rest during the day. And probably most importantly, because we're talking here about mortality, is the impact on drowsy driving. So in Kentucky, the percent of teens involved in car crashes decreased by 16% compared to an increase of 9% in the rest of the state. In a study in Virginia that compared 2 adjoining, very sociodemographically similar communities, Virginia Beach and Chesapeake, one of which started at 7:20 and one at 8:40, found a 40% higher car crash rate in the school that started earlier, and most of those accidents were occurring in that earlier time period of students driving themselves to school. And perhaps most compellingly, the study that was published just a couple of weeks ago found a reduction in crash rates in 16 to 18-year-olds in those communities that delayed their start time by 65 to 70%. 65 to 70%. It's hard to think of any other operational measure that could decrease driving crashes by that profound an amount. And finally, decreased sleep has been associated with an increase in sports-related injuries in high school athletes. So on so many different levels, this impacts the health and well-being of our students. And coming down to dollars and cents, there was a report that was issued in 2011 by the Brookings Institute that examined the 3 top ways that they felt would most improve schools, student achievement. And one of those top 3 mechanisms was delaying high school start times. So they estimated that moving start times an hour later would have a benefit to cost ratio of 9 to 1. And this was based on a conservative estimate of both costs per student to change the high school start time, which were largely related to transportation busing costs, compared to the increase in projected future earnings per student, secondary to a gain in test scores, which was approximately $17,500 per student. So even boiling this down to straightforward dollars and cents, it's a winning equation. And I mentioned earlier that students in middle school, particularly 7th and 8th graders, are also experiencing some of the same circadian and biological changes in sleep. And indeed, very similar patterns have been identified in middle schoolers, so that those who started earlier got less sleep and had more evidence of daytime sleepiness, more tardiness, lower grades, and in fact, delaying start times for middle school students is accompanied by many of the very same positive changes we see at the high school level. More sleep, tardiness improved, academic performance improved, better performance on tasks of attention, for example. Now, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about both other kinds of important changes that schools and families can make to ensure that their teenagers are getting enough sleep, and also to talk about some of the challenges that schools face in enacting this measure, and what are some of the ways that these challenges can be overcome. So, as a society, we need to emphasize that sleep is a health priority. And in fact, many of the professional groups, the health professional groups, like the American Medical Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics, have now come out with statements that support the importance of sleep as a public health issue, particularly in adolescence. We need to include sleep as part of student health education, along with all the great things we teach kids about nutrition and physical activity and wearing seatbelts and using sunscreen and not smoking cigarettes. We need to teach them about the importance of sleep as a key health ingredient. We need to help students manage their schedules so they have time for adequate sleep. And that's a real challenge, particularly for high-achieving students who are involved in a million different extracurricular activities. Finding that time, that window of opportunity for sleep, can be very challenging. Maybe homework burden needs to be re-examined. And you know, one of the nice things about a district contemplating making this change is that it allows you to look at other changes that could be made in conjunction with delaying start times that might bolster or further the impact of delayed school start times. So I'll give you some examples of that in a minute.